The house was quiet when I arrived, much quieter than usual. My dad's car was in the driveway, his friend Mark's truck parked beside it. Mark was a familiar presence, often at our house for dinner or helping with repairs. I used to joke that he was practically family. But tonight, the silence that greeted me was unsettling, as if the house held its breath. I dropped my bag by the door, the soft thud echoing in the stillness. Something felt off. My dad usually greeted me the moment I stepped in, his booming voice filling the space. But tonight, nothing. I called out, "Dad?" My voice sounded strange in the quiet. No response. I stepped into the living room. A glass of wine sat on the coffee table, untouched, the condensation pooling at its base. The television was on but muted, the screen flickering with a sitcom neither of them watched. My pulse quickened. Something about this scene felt too staged, too deliberate. As I moved down the hall toward my dad's room, I heard it, a faint, muffled sound, like a voice, followed by the creak of a bed. I froze. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. Voices? No, it was laughter. Soft, intimate laughter. My feet carried me forward, though every step screamed at me to stop. The door to my dad's room was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. I leaned in, the voices now clearer, his and Mark's. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, playful, teasing, and something else, something intimate. My hand hovered near the doorframe, my breath shallow as I peeked through the crack. What I saw made my stomach drop. My dad and Mark were tangled together, their bodies too close, their movements too intimate for anything other than what it was. Shock hit me first, a cold rush that froze me in place. Then confusion, anger, and something I didn't want to admit, envy. I pulled back quickly, afraid they'd see me, my chest heaving with the effort to suppress the panic bubbling inside. I stumbled back to my room, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. My mind raced, images I wanted to forget flashing behind my closed eyes. My dad and Mark. Together. It didn't make sense. Or maybe it did. Maybe there had been signs all along. The way Mark always lingered after dinner, the way my dad laughed more when he was around, the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. But what bothered me most wasn't just the betrayal of trust. It was the strange, undeniable pull I felt toward Mark. I hated myself for it, hated the way my thoughts refused to leave him alone. His easy smile, the way he carried himself, the warmth he brought into every room he entered. It had always been there, simmering under the surface, though I'd never dared to acknowledge it. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to make sense of it all. The betrayal felt sharp and jagged, like a glass shard lodged in my chest. My dad had always been my rock, the steady, unshakable force in my life. And Mark? Mark was supposed to be his friend, not whatever this was. Hours passed as I sat in the quiet of my room, the muffled sounds from down the hall eventually fading into silence. I didn't know what to do or how to feel. Should I confront them? Pretend I hadn't seen anything? And what about this strange, growing fixation on Mark? The questions spun in my mind until exhaustion finally claimed me. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the discovery settled over me like a heavy blanket. When I woke the next morning, the house was alive again, bustling with the familiar sounds of breakfast being made. For a brief moment, I convinced myself it had all been a bad dream. But then I heard his voice, Mark, laughing softly at one of my dad's jokes, and the memory of the night before came rushing back with brutal clarity. I didn't join them for breakfast. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed in my room, the walls closing in as I wrestled with the enormity of what I had seen. My dad's laughter echoed faintly through the house, a sound I had always found comforting. Now, it felt hollow, a reminder of the secret I was now burdened with. But even as anger and confusion consumed me, another emotion began to creep in, curiosity. I couldn't stop thinking about Mark, about the way he had looked in that moment, about the connection he seemed to have with my dad. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And yet, it lingered, pulling me in ways I didn't understand and didn't want to admit. By midday, I decided I couldn't avoid them forever. I left my room, my heart pounding as I entered the kitchen. Mark was there, leaning casually against the counter, a mug of coffee in hand. He looked up as I walked in, his smile warm and familiar, but his eyes seemed to hold something else, something that made my breath hitch. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth and easy. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze for more than a moment. My dad turned from the stove, a plate of pancakes in hand. "Morning, kiddo," he said, his tone as cheerful as ever. I forced a smile, the weight of the secret pressing down on me like a stone. They didn't know I'd seen them. They didn't know how that one moment had changed everything. As I sat at the table, Mark's presence loomed larger than life, his every movement drawing my attention despite my best efforts to look away. My dad chatted on about some upcoming project, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. And Mark? Mark caught my eye once, just once, and in that fleeting moment, I saw something there, curiosity, hesitation, maybe even guilt. Or maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was just trying to find something, anything, to make sense of the chaos. By the time breakfast was over, I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for something to break. But nothing did. Life went on, as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis the night before. But I knew better. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Avoidance became my refuge. I tiptoed through the house, timing my movements to avoid encountering Mark or my dad. Days passed in strained silence, each moment saturated with the weight of my secret. But Mark noticed. He always noticed. It started with small gestures, his eyes lingering on me when we crossed paths, his voice softening when he said my name. He didn't push, but his presence felt magnetic, impossible to ignore. Despite my attempts to stay distant, Mark seemed to close the gap effortlessly, as though he could sense the turmoil brewing inside me. One evening, the confrontation I had been dreading found me unprepared. I had slipped into the backyard, desperate for air, the cool evening breeze brushing against my skin. The sound of the sliding door caught my attention, and I turned to see Mark stepping out. His silhouette was calm, confident, yet there was a tension in his shoulders that I hadn't noticed before. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I shrugged, keeping my gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's a free country." He chuckled softly, the sound disarming. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he broke it. "You've been avoiding me. Did I do something to upset you?" The question hit me harder than it should have. I turned to him, my defenses rising. "Why would you think that?" He hesitated, studying me with those piercing eyes that always seemed to see too much. "You've been different lately. Distant. I wanted to make sure everything's okay." The concern in his voice threw me off balance. I wanted to yell at him, to demand answers about what I had seen, but instead, my words came out sharp and defensive. "Everything's fine." Why wouldn't it be? Mark didn't press. Instead, he sighed and leaned against the railing, his gaze thoughtful. "If you ever want to talk, you know I'm here, right?" I nodded stiffly, unwilling to trust my voice. He stayed for a while longer, the silence between us stretching and shifting. Then, just as quietly as he had come, he left. But that night, his words echoed in my mind. "You know I'm here." It was simple, almost casual, yet it felt loaded with meaning. A few days later, fate found a way to throw us together again. I was wandering through the park near our house, seeking solace in the quiet hum of nature. The sight of Mark, sitting on a bench, startled me. He was engrossed in a book, the late afternoon sunlight casting golden hues over his features. I considered turning back, but he looked up before I could. His face lit with recognition, and before I knew it, he waved me over. "Hey, fancy meeting you here." I hesitated, every instinct urging me to walk away. But something in his tone, warm and inviting, rooted me to the spot. Against my better judgment, I approached. "What are you reading?" I asked, my voice tentative. He held up the book, a worn paperback of some classic I vaguely recognized. "Something light," he joked. I sat down, keeping a careful distance. "Didn't peg you for the literary type." Mark laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "There's a lot you don't know about me." His words hung in the air, their double meaning unmistakable. I glanced at him, searching for a clue, but his expression was unreadable. Our conversation meandered, touching on everything and nothing. He asked about my plans, my interests, things I hadn't even thought about in months. And slowly I found myself relaxing. There was something about Mark, his calm demeanor, his quiet attentiveness, that made it easy to forget the chaos surrounding us. But just as I was beginning to enjoy his company, he turned the conversation back to me. "You seemed upset the other night. Did something happen?" My guard shot up instantly. "No," I said too quickly. "Why would you think that?" He studied me for a moment, his gaze gentle but unwavering. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. I want to make sure you're okay." Something in his tone cracked the wall I had been so carefully building. Before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. "I saw you. That night. With my dad." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's expression shifted, a mix of shock and guilt flashing across his face. He paused, searching for words. "I didn't realize you." "I didn't mean to see anything," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "But I did. And now I don't know how to deal with it." Mark looked away, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "I'm sorry. You weren't supposed to see that." His apology hit me like a wave, stirring up emotions I hadn't even realized I was holding back. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why him? Why any of this?" He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated," he admitted. "Your dad, he's been there for me during some really difficult times. And somewhere along the way, things got messy. I never wanted to hurt anyone." His words didn't make it easier, but they did make it harder to hate him. "Do you love him?" I asked, the question leaving my lips before I could think it through. Mark's gaze met mine, raw and unguarded. "I care about him. But love? I don't know." The honesty in his voice was disarming, and for the first time, I saw him not as the man who had betrayed my father's trust but as someone struggling with his own emotions. The conversation lingered in my mind long after I left the park. For the first time, I felt like I understood Mark, even if I didn't agree with his choices. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more between us, something unspoken but undeniable. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about him more often. Every interaction, every shared glance, seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. And though I knew it was wrong, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to know him better. Mark wasn't just my dad's friend anymore. He was something else, something I couldn't yet name but couldn't ignore. The lines were blurring and I was powerless to stop it. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. My dad had been acting strange, picking up on my avoidance and the strained atmosphere that hung between Mark and me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he cornered me in the kitchen, his voice edged with concern. "All right, what's going on?" he asked, crossing his arms. His usual jovial demeanor was gone, replaced by something sterner. "You've been distant, and I know you're upset about something. Is it school? Work? Talk to me." I froze, my heart pounding as the weight of my secret threatened to choke me. I wanted to lie, to brush him off and retreat to my room, but the tension had been building for too long. It had to break. "It's not school," I said carefully, my voice tight. "It's you. And Mark." His expression shifted instantly, his arms falling to his sides. "What about Mark?" I took a deep breath, forcing the words out before I could second-guess myself. "I know about you too. I saw you." The silence that followed was deafening. My dad's face paled, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it, But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy sigh. I never wanted you to find out like that. The admission hit me harder than I expected. Hearing it aloud made it real, undeniable. How long? I asked, my voice trembling. Does it matter? He countered, his tone defensive but tinged with regret. It's complicated, and it's not something I ever wanted to burden you with. Burden me? I snapped, the anger I'd been suppressing finally bubbling to the surface. You're my dad. And Mark, he's supposed to be your friend. How could you do this? To me? To us? I didn't plan for this to happen, he said, his voice rising. But life isn't black and white. People make mistakes. We feel things we don't always understand or control. Before I could respond, Mark's voice cut through the tension. Maybe we should all take a step back. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his usual calm replaced by a nervous edge. He looked between us, his expression pained. This isn't helping anyone. Why are you even here? I demanded, my anger redirecting toward him. Haven't you done enough? Mark flinched at my words, but he didn't back down. I came here because I care about both of you, he said, his voice steady despite the tension. This situation is messy, and I take responsibility for my part in it. But that doesn't mean we can't find a way to move forward. Move forward? I repeated bitterly. How? You've already crossed the line. Both of you. My dad stepped in then, his voice firm. That's enough. This isn't just about you, and it's not just about me and Mark. It's about figuring out how we deal with this as a family. His words stung, but they also forced me to pause. He was right. This wasn't just my burden to bear. It was all of ours. And as much as I hated to admit it, part of me still cared about Mark, even if I didn't fully understand why. The conversation ended abruptly, each of us retreating to our corners of the house, the silence heavier than ever. But the confrontation had opened a door that couldn't be closed. A few days later, Mark found me in the backyard again, the same place where we'd had our first real conversation. This time, though, there was no small talk, no attempt to ease into the moment. I think we need to talk, he said, his tone serious. I don't think there's anything left to say, I replied, crossing my arms defensively. There's a lot left to say, he countered. I care about your dad. Always have. But what happened between us? It was never supposed to happen. His words sent a chill down my spine. What do you mean between us? Mark hesitated, searching for the right words. I mean the way we've been looking at each other, the way we talk when we're alone. It's not appropriate, and I need to take responsibility for that. The air between us felt electric, charged with unspoken emotions. So what are you saying? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying this has to stop, he said firmly. Whatever it is, whatever it could be, it's not right. For me. For your dad. The finality of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked away, blinking back the sting of tears. So that's it? You're just walking away? I'm not walking away, he said gently. I'm doing what's best for everyone. You deserve more than this, than me. His honesty was like a knife, cutting through the confusion and anger that had clouded my mind for weeks. As much as I hated to admit it, he was right. In the days that followed, things began to shift. Mark stopped coming around as often, giving my dad and me the space we desperately needed. Slowly, the tension in the house began to ease, replaced by cautious attempts at rebuilding trust. My dad and I talked more openly than we ever had before. He explained his feelings for Mark, the loneliness he had felt for years, and the connection they had formed. It didn't excuse his actions, but it helped me understand them. As for Mark, he became a memory that lingered at the edges of my thoughts, bittersweet and unresolved. I knew I would carry the experience with me for a long time, but I also knew it was time to move forward. The story didn't end with a neat resolution or perfect closure. Life rarely does. But it ended with growth, with the beginnings of healing, and with the understanding that some connections, no matter how powerful, are not meant to be. And in that understanding, I found peace.